Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining the two-day working group meeting. This is to discuss the revised straw proposal for the Resource Adequacy Enhancements Initiative. My name is Christina Osborne. I work in Stakeholder Affairs. I'll be facilitating the meeting. Also, at the front of the room here from our policy team, we have at the far end Chris Devin, we have Lauren Carr, and Carl Mewson. They are our primary presenters today. So we're going to take questions throughout the meeting, and so we'll start with the folks in the room. Just a reminder to please use your microphones when making comments or asking questions, and also to identify yourself first. And for the folks on the phone, you can raise your hand by pressing pound 2. Also identify yourself before asking your question. And sorry, lost my train of thought. So this is the agenda for today. Chris Devin is actually going to start us off this morning. He's going to review the principles and objectives of this initiative. He's going to talk about the determining system RA requirements, and then also the forced outage rates and RA capacity counting. And then after lunch, we have Carl Mewson, who is going to discuss the system RA showings and sufficiency testing. And then Lauren Carr is going to go over the must-offer obligation bid insertion modifications. And then she'll turn it back over to Chris, who's going to go over the enhancements to the planned outage process, as well as the provisions reports. And then for tomorrow's discussion, Carl is going to kick us off. He's going to talk about the flexible RA, then turn it over to Lauren. She'll go over the local RA both before and immediately after lunch. And then Gabe's going to finish off the meeting talking about backstop capacity procurement provisions. And then I'll go over the next steps for this initiative at that time. We are recording both days. We're going to make those recordings available out on our website, on the initial web page. We also posted this presentation that we're reviewing today this past Friday. I did send around a link to as many people as I could for people who participated in the past, because I know it was a little late, but I just wanted to make sure you had a time to review it before the meeting. We are in the revised straw proposal phase. This is our stakeholder process graphic. The next step is going to be the second revised proposal, and I'll talk about that tomorrow when I go over next steps. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Chris Devin.
Hey. Welcome, everyone. Good morning. I'm Chris Devin with our infrastructure policy team, working on the RA Enhancements Initiative. Thanks for coming. We appreciate the participation on these two-day working groups. We know that it's a lot to have people travel for 2 days, so thanks for everyone who made it, and for all those participants on the phone as well. So to start off the discussions, I'm going to go over our principles and objectives that we've developed for this revised straw proposal. But before I get into that, I just wanted to say, please jump in at any point if you guys have questions or need any clarification. And I would note that we're going to try to stick to the agenda as best we can, but I think today we have a lot, probably the majority of the topics perhaps scheduled for today, so we might have to push a little bit into tomorrow, perhaps, depending on how well we can actually move through all this stuff today. So with that, let's get into it. So some of the things we wanted to talk about initially, obviously the principles. We've tried to list out some specific principles to try to clarify and lay them out for everyone specifically in the proposal. So I'm just going to go over these that we've included for this iteration. We do welcome feedback on these, and if folks think we should include other principles or objectives, let us know. So the first one is resource adequacy framework needs to reflect the evolving needs of the grid. This has been a theme that we've been discussing throughout the initiative so far. Obviously, as the fleet is transitioning to a cleaner, more variable and energy-limited set of resources, we think that RA needs to be revisited. That's some of the major drivers for our initiative, looking at some of the changes that we have in mind. We think that we need to include an assessment of more than simply having sufficient capacity to meet peak demand. That's part of the proposal related to kind of our portfolio analysis idea that we're talking about later, that Carl will go over. Again, the RA requirements and assessments need to reflect those evolving needs. and we think that the framework needs to evaluate resources in a way that reflects their operational and reliability contributions in all hours of the year. The next principle I want to talk about is that RA accounting rules should promote the procurement of the most dependable, reliable, and effective resources. So this principle is really getting at the unforced capacity counting concepts that we're talking about in parts of the proposal today. We think that both non-RA and RA resources should be recognized and rewarded, or at least made transparent about how dependable and effective they are in supporting reliability needs. We think that this transparency will allow for resources to be procured and give us the fleet of the most reliable and dependable resources, supporting overall procurement. Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, Chris, thanks. This is Brian Thaker with NRG. I just want to ask you to react to that first bullet. I mean, it seems like a foundational premise of the RA program is the RA program acquires and puts under some arrangement to make sure that those resources are secured in advance, what's necessary to maintain system reliability. And the first bullet, you know, the appearance of the word non-RA resources seems to run counter to that. So can you just sharpen the pencil on that one a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So that may be just the way that I described it in that bullet, maybe not coming through as clearly as I'd hoped, but I think the intent there is really that we're trying to make sure that all resources that are interconnected and have, you know, GA with the CAISO have this counting convention applied to them, so that way, you know, they can be procured for RA later at some point, and we can make sure that everyone's on the same playing field, level playing field. Everyone understands what their resource is worth in an unforced capacity and, you know, in installed capacity or net qualifying capacity type of counting. So that's really the intent there. It's not meant to say that, you know, RA resources should get some extra payments or something like that, like an RA resource or anything like that. Does that kind of help clarify?
Yeah, let me take a stab at a paraphrase. Or what the ISO is not saying. The ISO is not saying that it should or will rely on non-RA resources to maintain. Yeah, okay. I see you nodding. That's really.
We're not trying to say that. No, not at all. Thank you. Go ahead, Carl.
Yeah, Brian, this is Carl from the ISO. I just wanted to add on to Chris's statement again. I think the focus here is making sure that year over year, month by month, a resource may or may not be an RA resource, but as long as we have comparable ways of looking at them, over time we'll converge to a more reliable fleet that is RA. So that's really kind of the goal we're having, is having that comparable standard.
Yeah, that helps. Thank you, Carl. Peter?
Yeah, Peter Griffiths, PG&E. I actually want to go back to slide 6 and ask you about that last bullet point in terms of RA framework must accurately evaluate and value resources can meet ISO's operational and reliability needs all hours of the year. Does this mean the ISO is moving away from the traditional way of looking at system planning in terms of essentially if you've got enough resources to meet your peak demand, you're good in every other hour of the year? Is that what you're indicating here?
Yes.
Is that going to be the case going across all types of RA in terms of the way to look at it?
So I think it's a combination. We're trying to continue the framework that we have in place to look at the peak needs. Obviously, that helps us set the requirements, the monthly, you know, RA requirements that drives most of the procurement. But I think we also want to incorporate the portfolio assessment concept to look at all hours of the year, making sure that we have energy availability.
So you're not moving away from the concept of meeting peak demand and then being good for all hours. I mean, I'm just trying to understand because you know, the RA part of the RA program in particular, like the must offer obligation. The must offer obligation is a 24/7 must offer obligation. And that's sort of the way it's set up, and that's the way it's designed. And you know, the ISO makes exceptions for particular types of capacity. But you know, if you're moving away from looking at all hours of the year, it seems like you want to still keep the peak hours of the year and still keep the looking at things, you know, sort of not chunking up the day in terms of looking at sort of the overnight period or the morning ramping period or the afternoon ramping period or the peak. you're pretty much saying, no, we're going to keep it the way it is and require resources to be available all the time. And essentially, I'm just trying to understand sort of what the concept is, because currently the ISO requires that 115% of the capacity that's needed to meet peak be available in every hour of the month. And it seems to me that that is, particularly when we move away from energy-limited resources, that that's an unrealistic expectation, and that it might make sense to essentially look at the RA paradigm a little differently in terms of saying, well, what do we need for various parts of the day, and have things set up on that in that way. So I'm just trying to understand how you're thinking about moving and whether it would be applicable to all aspects of RA.
Okay, so I'm going to take a shot at responding then. It looks like Carl wants to respond as well. So first off, I think it's a combination of both things. We need to include continuing to look at the peak hour of the year, of the month, and base our system RA requirements off of that. I think we also want to incorporate a portfolio analysis that looks at all hours of the day and all hours of the month to ensure that the transition towards these more variable, more use-limited resources need to be incorporated into our assessments. I think that we could also look at the way of potentially incorporating, requirements based off of those up front, but that's really kind of outside the purview of the CAISO. That's more in the realm of the LRA's RA program decision making. So I think what we're putting forth today is our hopes that we can incorporate some portfolio analysis type of process and modify our assessment process to incorporate that, but also consider input from LRAs like the PUC and the LSEs and how we could perhaps incorporate some of these requirements up front, or maybe changes to some requirements up front. So I think it's a combination of both, and I don't think it has to be one or the other necessarily. But with that, I'll let Carl add on to anything.
Yeah, no, I guess what I hear you saying is that you still percent of the peak bid every hour of the month. Is that?
No, that's, again, we'll go.
Why aren't you, but that's what the month offer obligation is.
So let's pause for a moment, Peter, and again, realize that we're defining a principle. The proposal we're going to go through over the next couple days is really an opportunity for us to put some meat on that bone and to explain how the offer obligations as we see them will work, how the portfolio analysis work, how these pieces all tie together. It's not really, I think, fair to ask of us 19 minutes into the first day of the workshop how all this will come together. I ask that you give us some patience to build that out and to explain how these pieces fit together.
I'm fine, listening. I just want to, is it the ISO's intention essentially to move away from looking at peak demand as the way of setting the requirements for RA?
It is a piece of how we're looking to set.
Okay. I just want to get that, understand that to be the case, because
But again,
we're talking about some very large changes then to the way RA is calculated.
We understand those concerns. We'll go through over the course of the next 2 days how we're looking at the use of net qualifying capacity that we've used historically, how that will continue to evolve, the implementation of unforced capacity, what that means for us, and the rules we have. So we understand and recognize that those in and of themselves are big changes. But on top of that, as we move to a system where, like you said, is a 24/7 must-offer obligation reasonable and real to assume that we're going to get all that capacity 24/7? I think you have to ask that question and then say, when we stitch those pieces together that cannot do 24/7 performance, are we still good? And so looking at how the system is evolving to meet our needs.
Then we can talk about it when we get to that part of, but it seems to me that by setting the bar at that high in terms of what the must-offer obligation is, you're basically saying that no, not everything is going to meet it, particularly as we move to resources.
Well, even if they've got to move 24/7, that offering zero may not be 0 megawatts based on what your forecast for output is during an hour, might not necessarily be helpful or constructive to say yes, you've got a must offer obligation for nothing. kind of trying to realize and recognize in RA space what it is we're getting and how it works with the other resources in the portfolio.
Well, but it makes a big difference to some degree if you're a resource owner, if you have to have somebody there to put in a zero bid to essentially have that requirement.
Understood.
And so I just want to sort of point out that certainly when you were looking at the local RA, there's the local RA is very dependent upon looking at the peak hour of the year and making that applicable to 8760. And I just want to confirm that the ISO wants to move away from that in terms of the way of the principle for looking at it.
So now there's an important distinction you've made there, Peter. One was peak hour of the year or peak needs is determined in the local capacity studies, as opposed to system peak and how we arrive at our system RA need versus our local RA need.
Well, but aren't we talking about all of RA here, or is just system?
We're going to work through all of that over the course of the day and how they interrelate. So it's again, how NQC is going to be used, how our local studies are going to be developed. I think it's particularly acute. The problem is particularly acute when you look at local RA requirements and having that one in 10 requirement, 1 in 10 load requirement be set for resources and have that be required 8760. Understood.
There's just a huge disconnect there.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, let's keep moving along because I think we need to get through these ones, but that's a fair question and concern, and I think you raised some interesting points, Peter. We're going to have to, work through some of these things today that should hopefully, tease out some more discussion on different aspects that you raised. So good preview of the rest of the day. Okay, so we already covered this one about promoting more dependable and reliable resources. The next principle we have is that the RA program should incentivize showing of all RA resources or as much contracted RA capacity as possible. So what we want to do here is try to avoid creating any disincentives or barriers to showing any excess RA capacity. We have observed that certain provisions we have in place now could cause that, and we want to try to balance the impact that any modifications might have on those kind of incentives. The next principle we want to talk about is the LSC's RA resources need to be capable of meeting load requirements all hours of the year. So this is kind of to some of the discussion that we just had with you, Peter, related to, that we want to have proper requirements. Targets should be easily understood and based on reasonable criteria that's applied uniformly across all LSCs. And we think that, again, the single accounting approach that we use traditionally, such as the current summation of NQC values, doesn't really ensure RA alone. So we want to make sure we look at all hours of the year. So this one is kind of related to that first principle as well. Go ahead, John.
This is John Gooden with California ISO. I just want to emphasize really that last point and kind of address what you're saying, Peter, that the enabling legislation that set up RA, Public Utility Code 380, said that the primary thing is meeting load requirements, not just peak demand and operating reserves. And so if you look back at that enabling legislation, I think we all have to sort of refresh what the legislation said about RA, that it is first and foremost about meeting the system's load requirements, not just an hour a month. Even though that's how RA has sort of been characterized over time because we had sufficient resources that had fuel backing, that's not the case going forward. And so we really have to look at the enabling legislation, how we meet our load requirements through resource adequacy, because I think that enabling legislation was quite prescient in that it didn't just address peak demand. It talks about meeting load requirements, and that's what we're trying to do with these changes in resource adequacy is not only meet peak, but meet our load requirements as well, all hours of the year.
Thanks, John. Peter?
Yeah, this is Peter Griffith speaking. I guess from my perspective, and that's, I understand that, John, and that's exactly what we should be moving towards. I just question whether or not we should be basing everything off of meeting a peak demand and looking at and applying that to all hours of the year.
Yeah, Yeah, I think that's a fair question and something we can talk more about as we go through the proposal today. So the next stuff I want to talk about is the objectives that we've listed. Sorry, we'll pause for a second. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, since you've moved off of principles. Sorry, Eric Little from Edison. Can I ask, would the ISO also include one more principle, which would be cost causation? Those who cause the ISO to incur a cost to backstop reliability are those that are charged those costs. I think it'll become important as we start discussing some of the elements later on.
Yeah, particularly related to the, backstop procurement mechanism. Yeah, I think that that's a fair request. We could include something like that for the next proposal. We'll, draft something up. If you have some feedback that you'd like to provide, in your written feedback about that kind of a principle to add, we'd encourage you to include that. But I've got a note of it, so we'll think about how to add that one to the next proposal.
Okay, thank you.
Fair question and request. Thank you. Okay, so some of the objectives I want to go over. We just listed some of the ones that reflect some of the principles and the proposal that we have out right now. We could update these, include more, or refine them as we go forward. But let me just go through a couple of slides here on the major objectives we have for the initiative. So, number one, updating the RA framework to assess forced outage rates for resources, and then incorporating those outage rates into the procurement process up front in the planning horizon. I think that's a major concept that we're going to talk about a little bit more today. We really want to try to get that into this initiative, and we've got, pretty good interest from stakeholders and feedback on it initially, but we want to develop that proposal so that it really fits and works with our RA framework. The next one is to conduct RA assessments based on unforced capacity of RA resources and then the overall RA portfolio's ability to ensure that we can meet load in all hours, again, and meet all of our reliability standards and load requirements, which we were just talking about in the principles section. We think that will help inform what resources are the most effective and help inform the procurement process. The next objective would be to simplify the existing RA provisions that are currently complex and interrelated to the extent possible, and also consider the impacts to any resulting incentives. So this is kind of related to our current, outage process for planned outages, requirements for forced outage substitution, how we deal with forced outages relating to the RAIM incentive mechanism, availability incentive mechanism, and how all these things work together. So hopefully we can try to simplify some of these provisions that currently we think are maybe a little bit too complicated, and create some perhaps incentives that aren't the best. Some other objectives we want to talk about: modifications that we want to make need to be coordinated and remain aligned with the CPUC process and decisions and any other LRAs, RA programs to the extent possible. So we're going to have a little bit more discussion on that item as we get into the accounting rules and system RA section. But that was something that we perhaps didn't make as clear in prior proposals, and we wanted to reiterate that for this one. That is a major objective of ours, and we want to make sure we stay aligned with any of the other RA program decisions that are made by the LRAs. Related to that same issue, though, we also want to, point out that one of our objectives is that we believe we can't continue to rely simply on an installed capacity-based PRM as the only basis for RA. Again, related to all this changing grid, transition to more variable resources, we think that just a simple installed capacity PRM measure may not allow for sufficient resource adequacy in all hours. So we're thinking hopefully we can incorporate these other concepts, including the unforced capacity concepts as well as the portfolio analysis concept, and hopefully that can help address some of these concerns we have related to that objective. And then lastly, we think that we can utilize both the NQC and unforced capacity concepts in the RA process. So this idea is trying to get at the objective that, we don't think we have to just do away with NQC to go towards UCAP. We can do both. So we'll talk more about that when we get into the next counting section. But again, the last sub-bullet there is we think that the must-offer obligations need to be tied to the NQC values to accomplish these modifications, and Lauren will actually talk a little bit more about that when we get into the must-offer obligation part of the presentation today. So any questions on any of the objectives that we have in those last two slides? Anyone on the phone?
Doreen, do we have any questions in the queue?
Please press pound 2 on your telephone keypad if you wish to ask a question. We don't have any questions.
Thank you.
All right, let's move on. Okay, so let's start talking about system resource adequacy today. This slide just provides an overview of the topics we're going to cover. So we have obviously a number to get through. Hopefully we can get through all of them, but if we need to, we might have to move like some of the import stuff perhaps to tomorrow morning, but we'll see. So starting off with system RA requirements, we want to have a little bit of discussion just about how we would set requirements for system RA, and I think go ahead before I even get into the slides. Jamie?
Sorry, I thought you might go through the schedule, so I was kind of wondering. Yeah.
Sorry, I could talk about the schedule if you'd like.
No, I just kind of related to the objectives, Jamie down there with the CPC. So you do bring up, and thank you for, putting as one of the objectives to align with the LRA or the CPUC. And I just kind of want to understand that alignment and that process, how you envision, because the schedule reads with board approval in the spring, and the typical RA cycle, has a June decision. So can you walk through your thinking about the alignment process?
Yeah, actually, so this is good. I was going to kind of hold off for that discussion until we get to one of the later sections in the presentation, but I think it's fine to just walk through it right now, and hopefully that'll streamline the later part of the discussion. But I think the idea here is, get feedback on this proposal from stakeholders, work on our second revised set out in September timeframe, early September timeframe. Utilize anything we believe is necessary to incorporate into the RA proceeding at the PUC. I think that's right around the time when you guys do your first scoping for the next upcoming proceeding, and then continue to enhance our proposal with a third revised straw before the end of the year, and hopefully be able to incorporate some of these aspects of the proposal that are clearly interrelated with the PUC's RA program in the December proposed decision for the RA proceeding, kind of scoping and what it's going to look at for the next year. So that's kind of our intent of how we will continue to work with the PUC and coordinate this process and this initiative proposal with, the RA proceeding at the PUC. So that's kind of the initial concept, and I think, the board dates and when we actually ultimately take this initiative to be, considered before our board, I think we can think about how that really needs to be aligned with the RA proceeding. If that needs to be held off until June or something like that, that's something we can, consider and discuss, and is certainly still a viable option. So, any response?
Yeah, just clarification. You said December decision. Was there that misspoke?
That's usually when they get the scope usually comes out in about October, and then we get the scoping, the final scoping ruling, and then opportunity to provide proposals and comments to the commission.
So the ISO is open to potentially pushing the board approval back to wait for a June decision from the CPUC. I just want to make sure.
Just like we did with the original FRACMU decision, have tried to do so over the course of time with RA. We want the processes to align as well as possible. Obviously, that creates for a slightly awkward dance, but we don't want anybody stepping on toes, and we want the process to work as smoothly as possible as well.
Yeah, go ahead, Peter.
So if I understand, this is Peter Griffiths, PG&E. So if I understand it, you're going to wait until the third straw before and get the comments on the third straw before you introduce anything formally to PUC.
I think in September we would be including some of the concepts in the, initial scoping memo comments. Is that right, Carl? That was my understanding.
We'd be looking to bring in a fairly well-fleshed-out proposal into the CPUC space so that, again, we can move it expeditiously through that process, having worked out many of the hiccups along the way through this process here.
So the expectation is that there will be very little changes between the second and third straw?
I don't know that that's necessarily a safe assumption. Again, we're going to work to reasonably incorporate and facilitate stakeholder comments to the best of our ability. So, I mean, to the extent that between those two iterations we see something of significance that needs changed, I think you should assume we'll make that change.
Well, but I got to say, you're going to put it into the record of the PUC. I mean, generally, if you are going to put it into the record of the PUC, then to some degree you will have to take a relatively large change to be able to change essentially what you're proposing to the PUC.
So, as Chris noted, what would go into the scoping comments to the scoping memo would just be to make sure that all relevant issues are scoped, and that would, again, be influenced by what was in the second straw proposal. But by then, I think we'd have a pretty good sense of what the scope is. And then the third is, again, still changes to what we've been putting out. But I don't think even between the issue paper and this straw proposal, our scope hasn't changed vastly. It's been pretty stable. And so, unless something big comes up in this space that we need to change, we think we can nail down the scope.
And is this process going to take into account what the PUC has teed up already for the next cycle in terms of some of the counties?
Meaning what they've already put into the most recent decision about what other working groups and processes have to be. I mean, again, that has to, they're under direction from the Commission's decision to undertake those. This will be something else that we'll look to have scoped into that. We understand that, RA has a lot of issues that need to be tackled in the upcoming years, and we'll work within the confines of those constraints.
I think sorry, just jumping in, I think what Peter might be getting at is there's counting or workshops related to use limited resources, and how does that flow into, this proposal and making sure that they're coordinated, because they're kind of getting at the same issues, right? We're trying to address, counting and valuing a resource for its value that it's giving to, the grid at the time and hour it's needed.
Well, first off, thank you, Jamie, for adding that clarity. I mean, it does help to provide some context and a specific example for us to reference. And again, to say that, what we put into the CPUCs through our, proposal is just that, right? It's the proposal. We will have opportunities to evolve that both here and at the PUC. That's part of the stakeholder process here and the discovery process of the PUC. I don't think that there's, again, anything inconsistent with what we've proposed and the opportunity to work through both of those processes.
Yeah, and we certainly plan to participate in any of the related RA counting workshops at the PUC, incorporate those as necessary into this proposal. I think they have some other things related to hybrid resources as well, so, in counting for those resources, so we want to participate there. To the extent we need to, create things like default counting rules for new resource types or update our default counting rules, that might be possible. I think that, we're focused more on making sure that the LRA counting rules, are transparent and provide, fair outcomes and help ensure reliability. So we want to participate there to the extent possible. With that,
I guess Peter Griffiths, PG&E. I guess I'm confused because my understanding was that ISO was already introduced a separate stakeholder process on counting rules for combined resources or combined technologies.
Yeah, we're going to open a new initiative on that one, but that's not primarily focused on the RA counting rules at all. That's mostly focused on other aspects like operator interconnection requirements, those kind of things. I think, the counting rules, could potentially need to be included here, it could be included in that proposal, but I think we haven't really got firm scope on that new proposal or that new initiative that we were opening up on hybrid resources. So sorry to confuse the subject a little.
Well, no, I got to say, so hybrid resources. I mean, you're assuming that what we're talking about here will be applicable to hybrid resources.
Any of the concepts like UCAP or the forced outage rate counting or anything like that would apply to any resources that are on the system that get RA value, period. Does that make sense?
Including demand response?
So, Peter, again, I want to focus really quick again. I'll note and be honest about this. We've developed many aspects of our proposal from the last full iteration. There are still aspects we need to develop. Some of the performance and counting rules for demand response, for example, as you mentioned it, or hybridized resources have not been advanced at this point in time. What Chris was talking about with the hybrid resources is to recognize that there are complications with those types of combined resources that extend beyond simply RA counting rules. We understand that in this space we'll have to deal with the RA counting rules as well as at the CPUC, but we're looking for something that's generally and universally applied to resources non-discriminatorily, which I'm not sure if that's the word, but anyhow, you get the point. Non-discriminatory. Yeah, whatever. I'm not going to.
Discriminatory way.
Yeah, whatever. We'll go that route. But the point is, we recognize that there's still some applications of UCAP and the forced outage rate counting rules that we need to continue to evolve. And so we're not going to be able to perhaps address that to everybody's satisfaction today. We recognize that, but it's all part of the process, and we'll continue to work on it.
Thanks for that, Carl. That was helpful clarity there. Okay, Steve and then Mark.
Thank you. This is Stephen Kelly with IEP. Just so I can clarify the process moving forward, if I understood what you were saying, you're proposing to develop a second revised proposal and use that information that you've gathered in your comments on the scoping memo with the PUC for the 2020-2021 RA cycle, and then correct, you are planning on using the third revised proposal as the basis for forming your proposal at the PUC later in the year for the 2020-2021 cycle. That's how you're playing it.
Yes, that is a very clear and concise statement that is correct and accurate. Thank you. Okay, so hopefully that helps clarify exactly what our intent is with how we would participate in the other proceedings related to this at the PUC. Obviously, if you have additional comments or thoughts, input on that, we welcome that. You could always, let us know in your written comments about how we should be coordinating any issues related to the LRAs. Okay, let's get into the system UCAP concept. So for determining system RA requirements, we want to talk a little bit about this idea of having a system UCAP requirement that we're proposing. We think that this will more adequately address the forced outage risks on the system. Because we have observed the impact of forced outages that exceeds the resource margins that are actually provided by the existing planning reserve margin based on the ICAP concept. So we do believe this is kind of a potential reliability concern for us. And the next slide, I'll show you guys a little bit about exactly what's happened recently that illustrates that to some extent. But again, we want to try to address this risk posed by forced outages up front. Basically in the planning horizon time frame rather than waiting until operating months and seeing when these forced outages happen and having more complex outage replacement substitution requirements and rain applied to them in a way that perhaps doesn't get us exactly the operational RA that we really need during certain periods. So we're proposing to develop a minimum system UCAP requirement that all LSEs must meet and show for RA. This slide, this is not included in the proposal, but I added it because it just recently happened, and I added this to try to illustrate some of this issue related to forced outages and the impacts of those that we saw recently during the stress days in June. So today I want to show you guys June 10th, 11th, and 12th. The 11th of June was actually a flex alert day, and as you can see here, the impact to RA when you took into account forced outages, actually forced and planned outages overall, looks pretty, large, actually. I think would just be the simplest way to describe it. But as you can see, we were going into those days with approximately 5,000, 6,000, and 4,000 megawatts of net shortage of RA due to these outages. So as you can see on the forced outage line there, the fourth from the bottom, we had in excess of 7,500 megawatts on the 10th, around 8,400 megawatts on the 11th, and then 6,100 megawatts on the 12th of forced outages. So that accounts for approximately 16% on the 10th, 18.75% on the 11th, and 14.4% on the 12th of forced outage percentage overall of the overall RA obligation. So that is pretty high. Obviously, this is just a example date that, you know, is provided for illustration purposes, and we want to just try to explain, you know, these kind of things are what we want to try to address with the UCAP requirement concept that we're putting out. Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, Peter Griffiths, PG&E. What's in the adjustments?
So the adjustments part is like the credits for demand response programs that the PUC approves. So that most of the credits come through the PUC process, RA program process, and then some of them also are the any of the RMR, CPM units that are also included in the credits as well.
And you're saying the ISO didn't call any of those any of those DR programs during these days?
No, I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying this is an accounting exercise. I'm not talking about the actual operations during those days.
Well, but your conclusion is you're not counting on those for RA, because you're basically saying that the calculation, the bottom line there.
No, I'm not making that. I'm not trying to say that. Sorry.
Well, but your forced outages the RA obligation. The obligation pretty much you're out. So I'm confused by what you're trying to point out here and what the distinction is, because if you're basically saying you don't believe stuff is available for RA, and I think that's what you're saying, is because you've adjusted it down and saying that those aren't real resources to meet demand or to meet RA.
That's not what we're trying to say. No.
Well, but you know, why did you take them out, I guess, is the question.
Okay, so the credits and adjustments piece reduces the RA requirement because those resources are under the RA program that the PUC has developed, credits towards meeting the RA requirement that they just take off of the obligation. So it lowers and reduces that RA obligation by that amount. So,
but those are real resources behind that, and you're saying that the ISO doesn't believe it doesn't have access to those resources?
No, I'm not saying that. I think we do.
Why have you done the calculation the way you've done it in terms of taking it out? Why isn't that outage based off of what the requirement is instead of the adjusted requirement?
Based off of the final RA obligation. If you'd like to add that back in, you could see that the number would be slightly below that. It would still be around, you know, in the excess of 14 to 15% on on some of those days. So the point is that when we talk about how much the installed capacity PRM actually covers for forced outages, we're talking generally in the range of between 3 and 12%. And if you look at the, you know, high range of what it's supposed to cover, these dates were above that. Even if you do add in those adjustments and do the ratio based off of that number, that, you know, 4,900 number instead of 4,500 number, it's still a very large amount of forced outages. So that's really all I'm trying to illustrate with this slide, Peter.
I guess I understand that you're just trying to illustrate the RA capacity is not adequate for what you think you need. But I guess I'm somewhat troubled that you're basically saying there's RA there that's counting for RA and the ISO has available and calls on, but you're not looking at that as RA in terms of this discussion.
Well, I think I would not characterize it the way that you have just characterized it, Peter. I think we do look at that as RA. And that's why the RA obligation we have for how much needs to be shown for supply-side resources is actually lowered by that amount. Go ahead, jump in, Jamie, please.
Yeah, Jamie, NCPUC. So I agree with Peter. I mean, these are supply-side DR resources that we're talking about, and even though they're not required to show up on an RA plan and be loaded downstream in SIRA, they still are, you know, showing up in ISO markets. So to look at it as a percentage of the RA obligation, you should add those back in. But I think your point is taken here that forced outages is incredibly high on this particular day. Could you shed some light onto kind of, is this like, do you have like a comparison to make to historical outages, and as the forced outage rate increasing, is there resource type, like technology type specific that we could kind of go into?
Okay, those are good questions. Thanks, Jamie. So I can certainly update this slide later for the next, iteration of these discussions with that adjusted number to look at, maybe we could compare both of them. We could compare it to the total monthly peak forecast plus PRM number and the final RA obligation number. I think that would be totally fine. But again, to your point, I think that the intent of what we're trying to get across here is that forced outages are perhaps, creating some reliability concerns for the CAISO. So I think to your go ahead,
on the adjustments, this is John Goodwin with the ISO. Obviously, that's not all DR. Probably a couple thousand or more is, but really, if we wanted to get to the bottom of this, not to go down a rabbit hole, but you'd probably for DR, we'd have to actually see what they scheduled because they're not scheduling nearly those kind of numbers, even though we're giving them that kind of credit.
Yeah. So I think we don't want to be saying that, those things shouldn't count for RA or anything like that, but we do see, that there are some concerns related to the overall RA program, especially related to forced outages. But to your point, Jamie, I think I lost my train of thought. Your question was about related to the outage rates and stuff like that? Yes. Okay. So now I remember. So we're going to talk a little bit about, we have some analysis to show you guys. It's just example analysis about the forced outage rates on certain particular resources. We tried to look at the OMS information that we have in our outage management system, to try to create, a fleet-wide average, those kind of things. The systems just aren't really set up to accurately track planned versus forced outages and on a system-wide, fleet-wide type of basis or fuel type, basis. So we don't have that analysis, but we have looked into the available, class average type of outage information that's available through the NERC GADS outage system and outage reporting system. I can just say that the WEC-wide average for all resource forced outage rate is like 8%. From what I've looked at. And so we've mentioned that in some of the other parts of the proposal, and I think it's not that we have seen like an uptick in forced outages that's driving this. It's just that we have seen instances where the installed capacity PRM perhaps doesn't cover, all of the possible needs that we have seen and observed on various dates. Carl, would you like to add anything?
Sorry. I just want to go back and just, even if we went back and looked at the monthly peak forecast plus PRM, the 4901 numbers that Chris has up here, and look at the forced outage rates based on that, you're still looking at forced outage rates in the probably about 13 to 17%. So it's really changing it. Again, we understand that if we assume they're 100% available, all of these credits are 100% available, it changes the forced outage rate a little bit. We get that. So I get your point there, Peter. But again, does it still push us to a place where we're feeling safe and comfy and all happy? No, it doesn't. And I think that's really the point that Chris was trying to make, is that we're really sitting on a cusp of some challenges with forced outage rates and making sure we account for them appropriately.
Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, Chris, Brian Thaker with NRG. I'm going to focus on one particular line, not the 49.1, but the forced outages. Looking at the ISO's 2018 market report, the quarterly averages for forced outages appear to be in the 2,000 to 3,000 range. So understanding that this data is anecdotal, it seems pretty far out of the distribution of what you'd expect. So, in a UCAP concept, how forced outage rates are going to work their way into UCAP values is going to be a huge issue. So the more information that the ISO can provide and, raw information on forced outages, I think the better off we're all going to be. So that's just a plea for, not just kind of anecdotal information, but a whole bunch of information to help drive to, a reasonable UCAP calculation.
Okay, thanks, Brian. That's a, fair request. I think we, can try to do more analysis related to forced outages, and I think that, yes, I will be the first one to admit this is a particularly large amount of forced outages, and we picked that for a reason, to illustrate that these things can happen, and that's what RA is supposed to cover as well. So, but I think you have a good point there, and we need to think about, providing some more of the distribution. We do have information on forced outage numbers across the year, so, maybe perhaps we don't have resource-specific information for for every resource, but I think we can provide some additional analysis to support and justify the proposal. That's a fair request, so we'll take that into account. Go ahead, Peter. Oh, was Mark in line? Sorry, go ahead, Mark.
Hey, Chris. It's Mark Smith with Calpine. Thanks. I just want to build on Brian's point a little bit. And Carl, I think you were recognizing that the calculation of UCAP is really pretty critical, but even if you nail the averages, you get the right data sources and you calculate the averages, they're still not going to represent days like this where you have a peak demand problem and a peak outage problem. And so I remember early on there was some discussion of performance incentives that would be based on different occurrences of peak demand. I didn't see that in the 91 pages. I might have missed it. It might be there still. Wondering if that's still part of the calculus here.
You want to respond, Carl?
So some of the specific performance incentives we've kind of tabled for right now, just trying to contemplate what we can tackle and when we need to tackle it, which is not to say that, you know, we aren't still contemplating whether or not we can do it in this space. I just don't think we can. I mean, the feedback I've gotten thus far is, wow, that was, and it was 98 pages, Mark. You know, it's a mammoth lift as it is, and trying to have the complexity of that specific performance is, I think we're just kind of holding off on that, but we are still listening if people think it's needed. We haven't taken it off the table, but it's definitely on hold for right now.
Yeah, I mean, just responding, I think even if you had an average UCAP for this day, you'd be 5,000 megawatts short on forced outages. So it's going to be an interesting exercise as we move forward.
We agree that, you know, like you said, calculating the UCAP and what goes into the forced outage rates is critical. I mean, that's why part of what Chris is going to cover here eventually is going to be talking about what outages get calculated. And we know that's a critical piece of this. But at the same point in time, what also goes into this is what resources are now being picked up for RA. Are we still picking up the ones that are going to have a 15, 20% forced outage rate? Or are we going to shift to saying they just don't have the value they used to, and we're going to move to more reliable, dependable capacity? So, yeah, maybe there will be, but it also drives to the point, Mark, that the final piece of this is not only is the UCAP counting important, but the UCAP need is important to make sure that what we're hitting as kind of that minimum threshold is going to give us the ability to reliably operate the system.
Thanks, Carl. That's a good transition to the next slide that I'm going to get into here. But before I go to Peter, then I want to just respond a little bit further to you, Mark. I think I would also add, you know, some of these concepts related to the incentive mechanisms, perhaps these performance incentive ideas that we have discussed previously, and also the existing modifications to RAIN. We haven't fully delved into some of the aspects of the proposal that need to get developed further. You know, I certainly would like to provide as much input and you know, proposed this detail that we can on some of these things, but we really want to try to shore up the concept of the UCAP counting, forced outage rate concept, and then focus a little bit more on some of those other interrelated incentive mechanisms as well as we further develop the proposal. So those things may come back into the you know, discussion in greater detail as we move forward from here. So that's a fair question, though. Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, Peter Griffith speaking. I just want to echo something you just said, which is basically that the incentive mechanism is at work here, and in terms of stuff showing up or not showing up in the market. And so, you know, if you really want to show that this has become a problem, you know, you should probably do some more analysis over time and see how the forced outage rates have changed over time, and to see whether or not the adoption of RAIN and how things have changed with RAIN. Because I think to some degree, when you put an incentive in essentially for not showing up and a price for not showing up, that essentially price will be taken. And so, you know, the question in my mind is, well, isn't an easier way to address some of this stuff in terms of if you want the forced outage rates to come down, is to increase the penalty price? I mean, isn't that the way the mechanism is supposed to work in terms of what the incentive is? Now, it may be the case that the incentive mechanism is not a good incentive mechanism at all, But I don't think that, you can point to sort of one extreme day or one set of days and draw general conclusions that it's not showing up and it's not working the way you were supposed to work. Now, yeah, I would expect the forced outage rates to go down with RAIN, but I also would expect them, if the price at RAIN were to go up, then I would expect that to be the case.
Yeah, so I think that's, fair comments, Peter. I think, again, I'm not trying to say that we're just drawing the conclusion that this is justified on the basis of these couple days. I just wanted to use these days as a, illustration of what we can face during certain periods.
But it would be good to see some more analysis on this. If I can make that request to be able to see some. I think we agree with that.
And, we try to do more analysis on the system-wide forced outage rate of just CAISO resources, but it's really difficult for us to parse through some of that data. I think that we can get some better information made available for the next proposals that should hopefully, provide this kind of, information that folks are requesting. So, more analysis on forced outage rate to come, related to exactly just the CAISO system as much as we can get into the next proposal. We've heard you guys loud and clear, so it's a fair request. Okay, so let's go to the phone. We have somebody on the phone, maybe.
Yeah, Noreen, do we have people in the queue?
Yes, we do have 2 questions.
Great, thank you.
Caller, please go ahead.
Hello, this is Habib Maiga with SCG&E. So regarding slide 16, the part that has been extremely confusing to SCG&E is, so when you look at the final RA obligation, you have that 45,000 number after removing the 4,000 adjustment. But then when you look at the total operational RA, you have 39,000, and that number was computed by removing the total number of forced outages. So the part that's confusing there is, on one hand, we increase the load by the 15% PRM, right, number, and then when we look at generation, we also we discount the total amount of generation by the forced outages. So there is always a feeling that we are double counting somewhere. So one can argue that although you're showing that minus 5,000 of shortage, the number might be even smaller than that, So how do we reconcile, increasing the load on one hand with the 15% PRM that's supposed to take care of the outages versus looking at how much outage we actually had and removing that from the total amount that, we had operational. I don't know if, that makes sense.
Well, yeah, I think I understand your point that you're trying to make, but I guess I would just respond in that the idea of adding in the planning reserve margin, that additional 15% to come up with the overall, RA requirement, and then also showing you guys the impact of the forced outages based off of, a lower number, the overall RA obligation. I get that there's some consternation here about how maybe perhaps the way we presented some of these numbers. I don't think that we're trying to, I don't think there's a case of double counting anything in these analyses that we've put up here. I think that the idea is really to try to describe that the forced outages were a large percentage of the overall RA requirement. Even if you take out that PRM number and you based it off of the 42,000 monthly peak forecast, that'd still be a pretty significant amount of, forced outage. So that's really all we're trying to get across here on this slide.
Yeah, and we agree, right? But if you base it based on, let's say, the 43,000, right, and you remove the roughly 7,000 number for forced outages, the delta would be less than 1,000 megawatts. So you're not going to have that 16% value or 18% value that you have on the slide. It'll be really, really small, or maybe even show that we actually don't have any concerns, So I think that's one area where we hope that the ISO can kind of reconcile the 15% versus using actually forced outages, because I think at the end it will lead to some double counting or some over procurement.
Well, okay, I would just also respond in saying that the planning reserve margin is also, supposed to cover our operating reserves and our forecast error, not just it's supposed to cover forced outages. So I think that this is not a case of, trying to create double procurement or over procurement or having some kind of double counting. It's really just trying to focus on the fact that the forced outages are a large impact to us. And I don't think that anything that we're proposing here would somehow create an issue where we were double counting. I think if we did what you explained in your, hypothetical and based everything off of the, real operational need without the additional, planning reserve margin, we would be, not able to even meet our 6% operating reserves, and that's a reliability standard, not to mention our forecast reserve, so our forecast error concept that's included in the PRM as well. So I think really we'll talk a little bit more through the rest of this slide deck or section of the slides on that exact issue, I think, a little bit more. So hopefully that should help provide some clarity there.
All right, thank you.
Okay, Stephen, and then Carrie. And then
Stephen Kelly with IEP. Devin, so I understand you're kind of focused on this UCAP thing, and it gets complicated, the analysis and so forth, which we've been talking about. Is the problem that you're trying to address, which is insufficient capacity in certain periods of the year, is that as simple as simply increasing the planning reserve margin by 1.5% or something like that to solve for the problems that you're dealing with? Because we all know that the system is changing a lot. Demand is very different than it used to be 15 years ago. Supply is very different than it was 15 years ago when the planning reserve margin was fixed at 15%. So I'm just wondering, is that a simpler way to skin this problem?
I think that increasing the planning reserve margins could address some of these concerns. I don't think we would, be comfortable with saying what number it should be or what additional margin we should add. I think we stated in prior discussions that we think that a loss of load expectation-based PRM, trying to meet a 1 in 10 loss of load expectation reliability target is appropriate or would be, appropriate and perhaps could address maybe some of this stuff a little bit more straightforward, perhaps. But I think that also takes place in other regions that include a UCAP concept as well, and that's what we're going to talk a little bit more when we talk about the coordination with the current RA program slides later. So I don't think those things are mutually exclusive. I think you can include both those concepts, and it can help to address our concerns related to forced outages in particular, but then also, perhaps a more intricate way of coming up with a PRM. Installed capacity PRM could address, other reliability concerns on top of just the forced outage piece. Carl, would you like to add as well?
Yeah, just to add on to that, even moving to and adjusting the PRM, even if you went and adjusted it by, 20% and said we're going to make it 135, I mean, the answer is, does that solve the problem? And the answer is, I don't know. Because at some point in time, as we move to, the portfolio of resources we're relying on to serve that load changes, we may be great at peak, but not so great at other hours. And so again, this is all part of a collection of ideas that hold together as a group. So simply trying to look at and focus on the planning reserve margin as the only tool may not be sufficient. Like Chris said, it may help with some problems. What we're trying to address over the course of this proposal is making sure that the system as a whole works together. So trying to just focus on that one piece may not address everything we need solved.
Okay, I'm going to go to Carrie and then on the phone.
Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum. I apologize if you already said this. I know I came in late. I was wondering if any of these lines represent forced outage substitution.
So anything that was substituted for a forced outage would be included in the operational RA megawatts there. So it's not split out specifically. I don't know exactly how much of the amount of forced outages had replacement or substitution associated with them.
Like it would be really low because you have the total RA showing minus forced outages almost exactly equals the operational RA, which would imply that there's basically no substitution, which doesn't quite jive with anecdotal evidence.
Yeah, and, you know, also the planned outages is relatively low there. So if you just add the planned outages, the forced outages, you get your total outages. That's the difference between the requirements and the operational RA. So, you know, I think that's something we could look into a little bit to provide some more clarity on these dates about, you know, what amount has been substituted, if any. But I do think that those would be included in the operational RA megawatt number.
I agree with you that they should be, but I don't think they are in here based on your final RA obligation being the same across the days and then your surplus being the same across the days, because substitution is daily. So it would just be a very weird coincidence if substitution is included here. And I just think that would be helpful going back to, I think it was Mark's point, to know, or maybe it was Brian's, to know whether RAIM is actually working here. Because if we are going to move to a UCAP, it would be interesting to know whether you still have to have some sort of performance penalty on top of it for these days, or whether we're not really getting, you know, substitution today, so maybe operationally we'd be fine.
I think that's a good point. I think we look into that a little bit more, try to enhance this so that makes that part a little bit more clear, transparent. So taking a note of that. Thanks, Gary. Okay, one more on the phone, then I'm going to move on.
Hi, good morning, Chris. It's Mark Holman with PowerX. A few additional thoughts. I think you touched on the one. In the first two rows here, you have monthly peak forecast and monthly peak forecast plus PRM. We actually did an analysis and looked at the 4 summer months for the last 3 years. And I think your intuition or your point, if you've looked at the data, is that you're exactly right, that the variation in load between the 1 and 2 and how high the monthly peak might actually hit, plus the required contingency reserves, pretty much eats up the 15% planning reserve margin. Some months you end up with leftover planning reserve margin after you consider variations in load from a 1 and 2 monthly forecast and contingency reserves. Some months you actually don't have enough planning reserve margin just to cover that. And when we looked at it, it roughly eats up all of the planning reserve margin just for those 2 items, meaning that forced outages is not covered by PRM if you allocate PRM to those first 2 pieces first. The second comment I just wanted to make was just that when I think about forced outages and I also think about the month-ahead system RA procurement, both forced outages and the substitution framework and the month-ahead procurement of that last 10% of system RA worked for many years because there was surplus capacity in the West, including on high demand days, hot summer days, that was available to meet that substitution, that was available for the month-ahead procurement. And what we're seeing now is we've seen roughly 1,200 megawatts of coal retired in Alberta or mothballed. We're seeing coal beginning to get shut down in the Pacific Northwest and also the desert Southwest. Isn't that there isn't surplus capacity out there, it's that it's not there by the time you go to do a forced outage substitution because other load serving entities are contracting for it for the summer season or for the winter season, posing challenges to the existing framework that a month-ahead system RA program and a substitution framework. I mean, really, when you think about substitution, what else is there if all the internal fleet has RA contracts? There's really only imports if they happen to be available. And so we're seeing that as really the forced outages and the move to UCAP necessary given changes in grid conditions that are occurring. The other one I'd just like to highlight is that on June 10th and 11th, I think there was multiple, in terms of how real is this and how concerning is there, I believe there was multiple NERC energy emergency alerts, even at a stage 3 level, including the CAISO. I think the CAISO may be on the 10th or 11th, but also others in the desert Southwest, showing just that this is really hitting reliability. And so then the final point I just make is that by going to UCAP, you get it more accurate. Of course, the devil's in the details of how you calculate it, but also this can really help for the efficiency because there's no longer a need or a motivation to hold on to import capability for substitution. That import capability could be released to allow import RA contracts to occur, for example, on a year-ahead basis, because entities aren't holding on to their share that they get from a load ratio allocation for substitution because you don't need substitution anymore. So again, really interesting slide. I think you're really heading in the right direction of trying to get it just right and most accurate so that you maintain reliability but continue to do so at least cost. I appreciate it, Chris.
Thanks, Mark. So, I appreciate the support and the comments. I think you made some good points there. I'm not going to respond directly to everything that you said, but I think, that we're thinking along the same lines on a lot of the concepts that we put forth today, and would agree with a lot of the statements that you made. Obviously, as we talk a little bit more about some of the other things like the imports and import capability, we'll talk more in depth about that as we move forward through the slides. But thank you for the input and feedback on the stuff we're talking about right now, Mark. I'm going to keep going forward and try to get through some of these slides. Thanks, Mark. Okay, so on the proposal for developing a UCAP requirement, we are trying to identify, a system UCAP requirement that must meet the monthly forecasted peak plus all the ancillary services. Oh, that's a typo there, sorry, and flexible ramping needs. So initially, we're proposing, we think, at least 109% overall. This is a little bit unclear. Sorry, I should have probably edited this a little bit more thoroughly. I think 9% on top of the 1 and 2 peak load forecast for a total of 109 UCAP requirement is what we're intending with the proposed UCAP requirement for the system-wide basis. But again, we also are thinking about if we need to add some additional factor perhaps for some kind of year-ahead forecast error, like about approximately 2%. So this is just an initial slide to explain the concept of really what we're thinking about for building up a bottom-up type of a UCAP requirement. We believe that approach is appropriate to actually establish a minimum system RA UCAP requirement. We think that it will help ensure that the requirement's met for all LSCs, and because we have multiple LRAs that can set different LRA-based PRMs, we think that drives this need for us to create a bottom-up type of approach to develop the UCAP requirement, and then it will also help mitigate the potential for leaning if certain LRAs set a lower PRM level, which we do observe occurring today and in historical observation as well. So, again, we really want to try to make sure that this stuff gets coordinated with the PUC's program and the other LRAs to the extent possible. But the idea here is just to try to explain the proposal for how we would set the UCAP requirement. So, we're thinking 109% of the monthly peak need would be a basis for setting it, and that, hopefully would be the floor, and we might need to add some additional forecast error, going back to that last slide, amount. So if we do think about adding some additional stuff, we're going to have to, provide some additional clarity on that in the next upcoming proposals, but this is just a starting point for us to discuss with stakeholders. So any questions on the proposed UCAP requirement concept? I'm going to get into the counting rules next, and we'll talk more about, how we would develop the counting rules and forced outage rate calculations and how that would all work, and then talk a little bit more about the coordination with the LRAs and PUC process, so how all these things would flow together into that kind of a consideration as well. Excuse me. Sure, go ahead.
YJ Pharmacy. On the flexible ramp, I think, can you go back to the slide 17? On the flexible ramping needs, I think you kind of assume 3% of the peak load. Isn't that flexible ramping really already being covered by counting the peak load? Because to me, flexible ramping is really like move from interval to interval. If your peak load is already set at 100%, flexible ramping, I think that product really need kind of procure move the energy from interval to interval. So in that regard, they still need to consider flexible ramping in the requirement setting.
That's a good point. I'm going to have to think about it a little bit more. I don't know if I have a very thorough response rate at this point, but Carl.
Wait, just to make sure, this is Carl from the ISO, just to make sure I understand, because I must sound like Darth Vader on the phone. By looking at the peak looking at the peak requirement, the only flexi ramp we'd need in that instance is then downward, and so there's not an incremental capacity need at that point. Is that really what you're driving at there?
I'm almost thinking about like the requirement kind of stack up like the peak load plus the reserve and then plus the flexi ramping requirement. I'm questioning whether the last segment of the flexi ramping requirement is already being covered by the capacity that serves the peak load, because flexi ramping requirements to me is really procured within the market to address the energy movement from interval to interval.
Right.
So it could be needed from 3 p.m. to 9 p.m.
Right.
Maybe 9 p.m. more from maybe the peak load is, or already to me already procured the capacity that can address the flex ramping needs. That's what I'm saying.
Right. So in that sense, I'm going to get a new microphone here in a minute. In some of the lower, can you hear me now? In some of the lower need intervals, let's say off peak, you have an abundance of capacity potentially available to you for flexi ramp at that point, correct? And you may need more in those intervals, hour interval to interval. But once you move up to that peak need, do you need any incremental flexi ramp up at that point? Do you need to reserve any more capacity once you hit that peak? So when we look at trying to set the need, trying to decipher whether or not we need more flexi ramp up relative to that peak, I think what I'm hearing you say is that the next interval you expect to be going down because you're at peak. And so you won't need incremental flexible ramping capacity up, so you won't need incremental additional capacity on top of that to increase the requirement. So the requirement would still be covering, the requirement at peak it still covers flexi ramp because you don't need any more up at peak.
That was my understanding of the comment, I think, said in a different way. Does that make sense to what you're asking? I think I understand.
I'm still not clear whether you should include FRP requirement in setting the total requirement.
Yeah, so. Yeah, I think we're going to have to, have a little bit more discussion internally, consider exactly what we think, should be included in this UCAP requirement basis. I think for sure we want to include the AS needs like, operating reserves, and I think anything additionally we're open to, discussion, to hearing what, feedback we get from stakeholders before we consider what kind of additional, margin we would want to include in this UCAP requirement concept. Jamie, go ahead.
Jamie Gannon, CPUC. So second bullet there, and I just recall it in prior RA proceeding rulemakings, the CAISO has proposed using a 1 in 5 weather year to set system peak for at least the off-peak months or the shoulder months. And I'm just wondering if that, you're trying to get at that same thing here by adding that 2% adder to the requirement, or would this be both? Would you still be going and wanting to use a 1 in 5 weather year for shoulder months?
So I would just respond in that I think it could potentially cover that same sort of a amount of additional need that we would perhaps be covered under moving to trying to do a 1 in 5 for the shoulder months or something like that. But I think that we're still going to try to move forward with this aspect of the proposal, regardless of if we have 1 in 2 or 1 in 5 load forecasting, I think, at least at this point. But I wouldn't really want to opine on, kind of the other input we had on that other concept in the RA proceeding at this point.
Well, but I think they're trying to get at the same thing, right?
I think that they're related. They're certainly related, yes. And I think we need to consider exactly how, either of those two options could be, fit into the RA program overall. I think that perhaps CAISO might feel more comfortable with having a, additional forecast error amount on the UCAP requirement, have that concept in place, just because that covers us for all periods of the year. If we were only going to do a 1 in 5 for the, shoulder months, perhaps, we might still see large forecast error in the summer months as well. So I think we need to talk about it more, have more discussion related to this with the BC as well. And so, if you guys have feedback on that, definitely welcome that. Go ahead, Carl, and then Matt.
So just to wrap up what Chris was saying again, the idea of having additional room for forecast errors, we put out the 109 as kind of a lower bound on that, but there's additional analytical work we need to do and analysis we need to do to really figure out, is 109 going to get us there? What kind of other things contribute to trying to set that minimum level, that base threshold of like, okay, this will get us through the days and the nights. So we've still got some work to do on that front, and we've just kind of outlined some of the things that we're currently contemplating that may go into that final calculation. We've not made final determinations on that yet.
Thanks, Carl. Okay, Matt.
This is Matt Barmack from Calba. I think you're going to get to this on the next slide, or maybe you're already there, but I want more clarity on how you're thinking about this jurisdictionally. Like, this would be an ISO UCAP requirement, and LRAs would not be free to set sort of their own UCAP requirements, or I guess this would be a floor. It's sort of different than today, I guess.
Yeah, and so that's a fair question. We're going to talk a little bit more about, how we want to coordinate both this and then the counting rules concept after we go through all the counting rules stuff. I held that back because I didn't want to get waylaid, but we've already done that now at this point, so I might as well just, try to respond the best I can, and then we'll have, additional discussion at that point. Hopefully that could streamline that part of that component of the presentation a little bit. But I do think that the idea really is that we believe it needs to be a bottom-up approach, that CAISO sets the number for the UCAP requirement. I think we're going to have some frank discussion about how does that really interact with the, installed capacity PRM from LRAs. I think that, we'll talk more about that in the additional slides, but I think that initially we don't really see that as being, a conflict or something that would create, inappropriate double RA requirement or, conflicting RA requirements or something like that. It's just simply another way of counting the resources, ensuring we get the amount of unforced capacity that we need to be, assured that we can operate the grid. But again, I think that there's been a lot of, feedback about how we need to coordinate this, and we're still grappling with exactly how this should all work together. So that's pretty much the best I can give you at this point, but we'll talk a little bit more as we move through the slides. Okay. Anyone else in the room? Eric, go ahead. Then on the phone.
Eric from Edison. So I do encourage us as we start looking through load forecast errors issues to actually get into the statistics of them to really understand what we're doing. The a priori, I expect the error to be 0 because on average it should be 0, otherwise our forecast is biased. And when we start doing that, we need to think about things like, should we really be using a 1 and 2? Should it be a 1 and 3? Should it be a 1 and 5? Are we using upper confidence intervals and those sorts of things, and at what level to determine what that additional amount is? I think the problem that I have right now is that I went back and tried to look at the history of how we originally came up with the 15% planning reserve margin, and I can't find anywhere that says it's X% for this reason, Y% for that reason, and Z% for this other reason, and here's how we came to this. So I think if we're really going to redo this, now's the time to sit down and say, okay, it's 3% of load and 3% of gen for ancillary services. It is whatever percent for load forecast error, if you will. We're taking the forced outage out of it, so we don't need to worry about that any longer. To come up with an amount, we've actually documented how we got to each of those percentages so that if we end up in this debate again, we at least know what we need to adjust and why. And hopefully that happens after my career is over.
I think that's a fair question and request, Eric. I think we can, work on, for upcoming proposals, having more of a close breakdown of exactly what component, create some figures, show exactly what we're covering with what amounts that we intend to propose, and then also, doing some more analysis about some of the load forecasting things. I think that's fair. We can look back and see, what did our RA requirements look like, based off those load forecasts, what did our actual results look like, and, various months we have that kind of data really easily available, so we can work on that a little bit. I think that some of the questions about what kind of load forecast we should use, those are kind of, intertwined with all the CEC and CPUC LRA functions as well. So we need to, think about that stuff when we're trying to propose things. I think we've tried to, kind of stay out of the hair of the LRAs as much as we can on some of these things. So, but I think that's a fair request. So I've taken some notes that we should probably, do some additional analysis related to that request. Go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, Peter Griffiths, PG&E. I just wanted to just follow up on that a little bit. So when you talk about load forecast, you're thinking about sales, or are you thinking about consumption? Or are you making that sort of a distinction?
It's a good question.
Yeah, and you don't have to answer it here because you don't have to answer it here. It's just a question about because I think the RA program needs to sort of consider how it thinks about behind-the-meter resources. But just asking the question.
Yes, and we see more and more behind-the-meter growing. That's a fair question. Should be based off of net sales or net load or gross load. Those kind of questions. I think because there are some reliability issues if we are not really covering for all of the behind the meter, and then that stuff doesn't show up. And we end up having to serve the load. We could have some issues. So definitely a fair question to think about. So I think all these questions and comments are well taken, and we will think hard and long about how we can address those in future proposals.
So wait, hold on. This is Jamie again at WC. So do we just have a discussion about moving from a sales forecast to base RA requirements on to a consumption forecast?
No, all I was really saying was that I think we need to think about kind of, what the basis for some of these forecast-based requirements are, why we're doing them, maybe explain some more of that, or, why we do it today, maybe if there are risks that folks see with using certain approaches, if they want to provide feedback on that, we could incorporate that into our thinking. We'll take it back and think about it a little bit more. We have not proposed anything related to that kind of a change on the basis for load forecasting. Again, as I was mentioning, in my response to Eric, I think the realm of load forecasting, what we set and establish the requirements based upon is really within the purview of the LRAs and the PUC and then the CT as well. So I think that we've been trying to steer clear of proposing that those things should be changed perhaps, but obviously we've been noting that we think that perhaps the PRM needs to get looked at. So I think it's also fair just to have a discussion about does the load forecasting meet our needs. So that's about it I have on that question, I think. Okay, so let's keep moving on. So we're going to talk about the forced outage rate proposal for capacity counting. We try to provide a little bit more detail here than we have in prior iterations, but I think there's still a lot of work that we need to do. So again, we're just going to try to cover and basically explain, what our thinking is, what our framework that we have in mind would be, some of the potential changes that might need to take place, and then we're going to talk a little bit about some of the, possible options that we have for developing formulas for how to, calculate forced outage rates for resources and what that means and some of the other interrelated aspects of the proposal. So let's get into it a little bit on the forced outage rate piece. Right now, again, we're really considering how we can do this in a way that, make sure that we have enough reliability resources on an unforced capacity basis, meaning, that we have taking into account for forced outage rates ahead of time in procurement and not just relying on substitution and the RAIN concept that we currently utilize to try to help make sure that we maintain enough operational RA. So again, we have proposed some new rules to account for this that we're going to go over. Again, it's intended really to provide more certainty that we'll have enough resources prior to the month rather than waiting into the operational month and then having issues related to, forced outages. So we think there's a lot of advantages that could come forth from integrating forced outage rates into the capacity counting value. We believe that recognizing the individual resources contribution enables all the resources to be compared and contrasted with other reliability of the other resources. That doesn't really happen right now. There's no, list of what the forced outage rates are for resources. So if you're buying a resource, you might, not know exactly how well it could perform. So if that is more transparent, hopefully that could promote better procurement of the more reliable resources, which also, reduces risks to the ISO and to purchasers of those resources. Hopefully they make more informed decisions when they're doing bilateral trades or, buying replacement capacity, that sort of thing. So we've talked about this idea of the UCAP concept or unforced capacity value for a resource. This is, frequently calculated in other regions. The general formula for a UCAP calculation is up here on the slide. It's the, installed capacity or their NQC value times the 1 minus their effective forced outage rate. So that's the basis for what we're going to use to develop the UCAP number. So we're going to propose to calculate and publish this on a monthly basis. So we'll have both NQC and UCAP values for all resources every year for each month. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how we'll do the forced outage rate on a seasonal basis a little bit later. One of the other notes I wanted to make on here as well is that the forced outage rate and resulting UCAP calculation is not going to be impacted if you have an approved planned outage. So we'll also talk a little bit more about the planned outage process as part of this overall proposal a little bit later on today. Okay, so this is the part about the seasons. We're thinking that we can calculate forced outage rates on a seasonal basis. So we're proposing to calculate both summer forced outage rate and winter forced outage rate, or peak and off-peak forced outage rates. We think that there's enough differentiation in the resources that we've observed between the summer and other periods that we think that this would more accurately reflect the real availability of these resources rather than having a single forced outage rate across the year. We did discuss the idea of using a monthly forced outage rate in prior proposals, and a lot of the feedback we got was that there probably wouldn't be enough reason to differentiate and create another calculation for every single month, and that does line up with most of the anecdotal evidence that we've looked at so far related to monthly versus seasonal type of calculations. But we do think that at least doing seasonal would better reflect their availability during the peak or off-peak seasons. Okay, so any questions on anything I went through so far on UCAP concepts? Eric, go ahead.
Would the CAISO plan on, Eric Little from Edison, would the CAISO plan on publishing the UCAP values for each resource for those periods so that the buyers know exactly what they're buying?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Just like the NQC list, we'd also have a UCAP list.
Okay.
Every month there would be both NQC and a UCAP value for resources.
And you get the summer and the non-summer values. Okay.
And I think that part of that, obviously, we'd need to know their forced outage rate. I think we're intending that would be public as well. But, obviously we want to think about, the UCAP value is clearly related to that, so you just back into that calculation anyway. So we got to think about exactly how we would publish some of this stuff. But the idea is to try to make it as transparent as possible so that when you're procuring, you know what ones are more reliable than others. Okay, back here in the room. Sorry, I don't know your name.
Yeah, Grant McDaniel with Wellhead. I think one of the more difficult things that needs to be done, but I do think it needs to be done, is to think about how, when you establish the initial UCAP values for a resource, you might remove those outages that were really caused by the incentives that are in place today. Because once you lift those incentives, some of those outages are going to go away. And I know that's really hard to do, but we need to give it some thought.
It's a fair request. I think we're trying to contemplate a way that we could transition into this mechanism in a way that makes it so that we can address that kind of a concern. We have thought about, maybe doing some kind of a phase-in approach where you start to, wait the years as we gain more historical data. Another big thing that we're thinking about is, actually getting the initial data all scrubbed and available. I think perhaps it's going to be challenging to try to go through our historical information that we have that's really not set up to do these kind of calculations, and try to apply a fair way of creating a UCAP value for resources or a forced outage rate for individual resources. So I think through this initiative, we're intending really to try to set out and establish the type of data that we need to get from resources related to their forced outages, and then a way for us to accurately track and record that information to create these calculations in a transparent way. So I think we will try to address that, but that's a fair request. Carl, would you like to add something?
Actually, I'd like to add a question back to Grant, which is to say, in order to start thinking about that, can you help us understand a little bit more about how you think the incentives that exist today, how resources are treating forced outages under that paradigm versus what they would do under a UCAP, and so again, just so we get a sense of thinking about how that transition what we might need to think about in that transition.
Yeah, I need to give it some more thought, but we'll include that in our comments, because I think we all kind of understand why the incentives cause this in terms of the planned outage processes and why people wind up taking forced outage when they really intended it to be planned all along. So it's just, we can put some thought into it, Carl.
Thanks, Grant. I think we'll talk a little bit more about, kind of the impact of the planned outage process and in that section as we go through this a little bit later today in more depth, so that we could have some more discussion on those issues as well. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, Eric from Medicine. Sorry, I need to try to understand this problem a bit better. Are you worried about forced outages for resources that are non-RA resources and how it would affect? Because I would think that the RA penalties are a huge amount of incentive to not have a forced outage from an RA resource.
That was, Eric, this is Carl. That was kind of my question, which is to say, in order to get out of the forced outage, the rain penalties now, they have to go out and get substitute capacity, which comes at a cost, and so that's kind of what I was driving to with Grant, which is to say, is there a reason those incentives would drive higher or lower forced outage rates? Again, I just want to make sure that we fully understand, Grant's thoughts as we try and transition into this space.
Okay, thank you.
And I would just add, I think, beyond just simply trying to perhaps, address the incentives or existing, impact to the outage process and how much we see outages happening in our analysis and in the way we do the calculations. I think just in a broader sense, I was just trying to get across the concept that we want to make sure that we transition this and phase into this so that we have something that is fair, that has everything based on a level playing field where we, have proper data and everything so that we can do this in a way that is, both fair and transparent. Okay, go ahead, Vic.
Vic Rivers, San Diego Gas and Electric. I want to get back to Carrie's point before about substitutions and such. It just has to be clear how that's handled, because in some areas there's not a lot of substitute capacity and it may impact whatever your method is for coming up with UCAP, or other areas where there is a lot of substitution, it may drive something else, just depending on how you handle the substitution issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a big part of this, and we're going to talk a little bit more about how we would treat substitution in the future for forced outages as we go forward through these slides. So hopefully we can probably have some more thorough, I'm sure there's going to be some heated discussion on that point, but more to come. Any other questions at this point? Okay, let's keep going forward. Okay, so we already talked about the seasonal forced outage rate concept. So we did a little bit of an example analysis. Again, all the stuff we talked about earlier, I think we heard loud and clear. We need to do some additional analysis on the forced outage rates and how this stuff could impact the proposal, provide some further justification for what we're thinking. We had a little bit of discussion in the proposal about how it's really difficult to try to parse out the difference between planned outage and forced outages right now in our tracking on individual resource basis. So we don't have a particularly adept analysis that explains exactly what the CAISO-wide forced outage rate is for all resources or for particular, fuel types or resource classes or anything like that. We did look into doing that kind of analysis, and we have, not been able to get anything that was really of useful value to provide to stakeholders at this time. But we do want to, again, reiterate that we did look into the NERC GADS data that was available for WEC, and so, that was an average of approximately 8% forced outage rate for all resource types that we're providing outage data. So again, that doesn't really cover everything. Obviously, I don't think that any of the wind or solar resources include information in GADS that we were looking at for that average. So that was more of the traditional thermal resources generally. But again, the point here is that we're trying to provide some analysis, so we did provide a couple examples that I'm going to go through here just to kind of show, what it looks like for an individual resource and why this differentiation amongst resources based on their forced outage rate is important to the CAISO. Mark, go ahead.
Thanks, Chris. It's Mark Smith with Calpine. I'm actually a little bit stunned by your comment that OMS doesn't give you the data that you need in understanding forced outage rates. I mean, it's all there, isn't it? I mean, whether it's forced or planned, what kind of forced it is, all that stuff's in OMS, isn't it? What am I missing here?
Yeah, so, it's a little bit more complicated, perhaps, than one might think. The major issue, and I'll just try to describe, what we've run into so far in looking at the data, is basically that the idea that OMS is really supposed to be providing payload to the market for making sure that we only dispatch the resource up to what it's really truly available for, that doesn't really matter if it's planned or forced. All that matters is how much is really on outage, the full amount. So we have this problem of mixing planned and forced outage in some of these data sets that we have where perhaps a forced outage lasted longer than 7 days, then it turned into a planned outage because they had put in a planned outage that, basically overlapped for the exact same reason. It's really unclear exactly what the planned versus the forced components of some of these resources are. Some of them are very straightforward, and as you'll see in the examples that we put up, we do have resources where the information is very well established and clear. But the problem is that it's just not clear or established for all resources because of these kind of overlapping issues with data where, the intent of the way that the system is created has been to, again, the market purposes and for operators to know how much they can dispatch those resources, and that is accomplished completely by the way that we have set up our systems. But nothing in OMS was really set up to say, give us an exact rate for the forced outages versus the planned outages. And that's where we're running into trouble with the analysis. It's just a whole bunch of information that takes a lot of time to try to clean up and make sure, was this really an outage? And we'd have to do a lot of calling resource owners, asking them those kind of questions, what happened during that period. We don't have notes about some of these things to really make sure and kind of scrub that data. So that's really kind of more depth about, why we're here today, why we haven't been able to provide perhaps the level of analysis some folks, would hope for. Go ahead, Carl.
So the short answer to your question is, Mark, is yes, it's all there. The question, though, is really about what was that data set up to do? It was not set up to calculate capacity. Therefore, what we have to do is go back and kind of reconstruct or reconfigure that data in such a way that we can get that unforced capacity calculation out of it and extract that. So again, it was built for something different than what we're proposing to use it for here, and so it's not readily transferable.
Yeah. Okay, go ahead over here.
Hi, this is Mike Whitney with the Northern California Power Agency. So I was just wondering, if the data sets aren't reliable for the forced outages, historically, how did you get the numbers for slide 16, and what makes you confident that those are accurate?
So that information is just that we had back in slide 16 was really based off of essentially just the actual CIRA information that we have. So that's, taking an output from the OMS information that we have, which does give us an accurate amount at a given time of exactly the total amount of outages that we see on a system. CIRA knows how much is planned versus forced, so that's how we arrived at those numbers on that, slide 16. So the difference in doing a one-day snapshot based off of the total amount versus a, case-by-case individual resource basis trying to parse out what was planned versus forced gets much more complicated with a lot more level of data analysis where you have to try to, parse out, was this really a planned outage, certain dates for certain hours, partial resources, where they were partially on outage, some of them were D-rate, some of them were an actual planned outage, some part of it could be a forced outage. So a lot of these things just add complexity. It just takes a lot of time for us to do this analysis, but, it's a fair question. So that hopefully explains kind of the difference between the way we try to take like the high level look on that slide 16 analysis versus what it would take to do some of the more, rigorous stuff that folks have been asking for related to this UCAP concept. So let's get into the examples, and then this probably will spur some additional comment and questions. So, okay, we're about 10 minutes before we should break for lunch, so let's try to get through a little bit more of this, and then I'll probably have to come back to this after lunch. So we took 2 example units that we provided here. We provided their outage rates for planned and forced outages that we looked at for both the summer and annual periods of 2018. These are actual resources, but obviously we just masked the name of the resource just to provide some, illustrative example here of how it can change over the overall, seasonal forced outage rate versus, an annual outage rate. And I think we could look at, a winter period, and you'd see a different number as well. So, the idea here for this resource is when you look at the summer, it had 0 planned outage percentage, it had 11.4% forced outage rate. And then, if you look at it over the whole year, it had 2.14% planned outage and 9.17% forced outage rate. So, that isn't a drastic change, but we think that, you can see in the next slide there is a bit more of a variation here. So this is another example resource that we've looked at for the summer and annual periods of 2018. And as you can see here, this one has, in the summer, 25% forced outage rate and 8% planned outage rate. And then if you look at it over the whole season or the whole annual period, it was a 15% forced outage rate and 26% planned outage rate. So that one's obviously operating in a different manner, doing a lot more planned outages, perhaps in off-peak periods, as you might expect. And obviously there's a much different variation in the forced outage rate. So again, these couple examples we just threw up here were really trying to illustrate the idea that it's important to CAISO to differentiate between resources. If we got a resource that was, 11% forced outage rate, and that's a, 100 megawatt resource, for instance, that would, give us something around the, 88 megawatts of unforced capacity value there. And then I think if you looked at this one with 25% forced outage rate, that one's, obviously lower, closer to like 75 megawatts of UCAP after you would, do our hypothetical calculations we've talked about. So provides a different level of reliability. It really, that we can expect on average, that those different resources would provide, and the idea behind our proposal is to try to make that more transparent and ensure that we're getting enough on average that we can meet our reliability needs. So those are just a couple examples, just again for illustrative purposes. I think we can try to do additional analysis on some of the other kind of larger data sets that we have, like overall forced outage trends, those kind of things that other folks have asked about. So if folks do have additional ideas about analysis that we might be able to undertake to try to help explain things a little bit more, we'd welcome that feedback as well. Any questions on these example units? Okay, let's keep moving on. Get through a couple more slides before lunch here. So this is the slide where we're going to talk about our proposed interval for the assessment for forced outage rates. We're proposing to apply a 16-hour window between the hours of 5 a.m. and 9 p.m. for assessing these resource-specific forced outage rates. As we get through here, I'll incorporate kind of this window period into the formula that we talk about a little bit later, and then try to explain how those are related. But the idea is that this period would cover when resources are really in high demand to meet our CAISO needs, and hopefully can simplify the availability assessment hours that we use, primarily for the idea of generic and flexible capacity. As you can see on the third bullet here, we think that if you use the same interval for calculating forced outage rates, you can have one single forced outage rate that you can apply for both generic and flexible capacity, which hopefully simplifies things, which is one of our objectives, is try to help simplify the RA program as much as we can here. Go ahead, Eric.
Just a question on that window, Eric from Edison. I'm fine with whatever we come up with. I don't care how many hours there are in it as long as it's meeting the reliability need. But the question that I have is particularly for summer. Having been sitting out here last night, the sun's nearly not setting until 9 p.m. Isn't the ISO still seeing a net peak load need that happens from 9 to 10? And if so, why are we setting that 16-hour window to end before that?
Yeah, that's a good point. Let's make it 17. No, I think we're open to adjusting it.
And
that's a fair question, though. You know, I think this is our initial proposal. I think that the observation that we could see some net load peaks, you know, still at significant megawatt values during 9 to 10 is fair. Really what we're trying to do here is try to focus in on the hours of most demand, so that does seem like that could fit in there. You know, perhaps we need to expand it to 17 hours, but I think this was just, again, an initial proposal to try to pare down on some of the amount of hours that we would look at so that we can really see when the forced outages are really most impactful to the system overall. Obviously, we think that any forced outages are important, so there's arguments that folks have made about maybe you should just look at all 24 hours. So if folks have strong opinions on, you know, what assessment hours we should utilize, let us know. As we get into more thorough development of this concept, we can talk a little bit more about how they do it in some other areas, but they actually look at sometimes there's another concept that we included in some of our prior proposal, you know, background information that they use in other regions that's basically incorporating really only the hours that those resources are actually in demand. And so that makes an additional level of complication where you look at only times when they have been called upon by the you know, operator, and then use that as a component into their overall ultimate forced outage rate concept that they use. But that gets additional layers of complexity, and so, you know, we want to think about how much we need to balance complexity and simplicity and you know, getting what we really need out of this. So I think that's a fair question, though. And, you know, again, we're open to changing some of these concepts of the parameters that go into the calculation, how we should calculate things, and still trying to develop those concepts a little bit more. Okay, a couple more minutes before noon time, so I'm going to keep going. So this slide we're talking about here, utilizing 3 years of historic data to determine the calculations. We had been saying 3 to 5 years. We're just proposing 3 years at this point. Again, open to some adjustments here if folks think it's necessary, but we think that, you know, each forced outage should actually impact a resource's seasonal forced outage rate and ultimately their UCAP value for a period of at least 3 years. This is pretty much standard practice in all the other regions. And we are also considering an idea of incorporating a weighting method that places more weight on the more recent years, so that more, you know, historic periods from further in the past have less of an impact on the overall resulting forced outage rate. And the idea here that we're going to propose at this point is just a 50% weight for the most recent year, 30% for the second historical year, and then 20% for 3 years back. And use that weighting so that, you know, resources that perform particularly well in the most recent history can improve their UCAP value, you know, reduce their forced outage rate, and then, you know, obviously on the flip side of that, resources that perform particularly poorly in the most recent period would have their UCAP value and forced outage rate impacted accordingly as well. So that idea is, you know, again, trying to make sure that resources still have a capability or you know, an opportunity to improve their forced outage rate as you perform better over time, and then also to reflect those ones that may not be performing as well. Okay, so I think I'm going to pause there before I get into ELCC discussion and let everyone go for lunch unless there's any final questions before lunchtime.
Noreen, do we have any questions on the phone?
At this time, there are no questions in queue.
Okay.
All right, everyone. So let's come back at 1, and I'll pick back up from where we left off. Thank you.